Evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Rashmi Poddar, and I am the director of Jnanapravaha, an institute for aesthetics and critical theory in Mumbai. I'm also a founding member of the Asia Society India Center. Asia Society's programs across our 14 centers are now virtual and global. We have hosted more than 600 programs during this lockdown, including some very interesting discussions on food security, public health, and world politics. They are all available on our YouTube page, so do go ahead and view these webinars whenever you have the time. The recently released National Education Policy, NEP in brief, 2020, with key aims of imparting 21st century skills and promoting experimental learning has introduced major changes in higher education in the country. Two pressing challenges of low enrollment numbers and complex regulatory structures have been addressed. Digital learning and tech-based platforms could be the game changers in this process and have been mentioned in the policy as vital tools needed to reduce the rural-urban divide. The policy also aims to give impetus to research and development. While NEP draws a promising picture, its realization will be determined by how it addresses the problems of access, infrastructure, and resources to implement them effectively. Today's conversation will discuss this in detail. Allow me to introduce our esteemed speakers this evening. Kapil Viswanathan serves as the chairman of the executive committee at Krea University. Mr. Viswanathan is also the president of the Institute for Financial Management and Research, IFMR, a not-for-profit society focused on education and research. Dr. Anju Seth is the director of the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Dr. Seth has a distinguished academic career spanning over 25 years with global experience in the USA, Europe, and India. Vineet Gupta is the co-founder and managing director of Jamboree Foundation, as well as the founder and trustee of Ashoka University. He also serves as a trustee of Plaksha University, which he founded in 2015. Ritika Chopra is a senior assistant editor with the Indian Express in New Delhi. Ms. Chopra has over 14 years of experience in journalism, reporting on politics, government policy, and education. A bit of housekeeping before we proceed. All those who are joining us on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. For our audience on Facebook, please drop them in the comment section. I would now like to invite Ritika to commence the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Poddar, for that generous introduction. We have just a little over an hour to discuss a policy which aims to usher in transformative changes in the education space. I think we should, let's just jump right into it. We should start by getting a snapshot of the impression of each. I would request each of the panelists to kind of give us a snapshot of your initial impressions of the policy document. It would be great if you could just take 2 minutes to take us through what you think was the highlight of the new education policy. And it would also be great if you could speak of one area that you think that the policy probably does not address or has inadequately addressed. Can we start with you, Dr. Seth? Dr. Seth is the director of IIM Calcutta. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening. I believe that the national education policy is visionary in terms of its outlook, in terms of its vision and its objectives at a very high level. Many of the principles that it espouses are those that are near and dear to the hearts of most educationists. So, for example, when the education policy talks about learning that is um, the conceptual basis of learning outcomes, disciplinarity, um, critical thinking. These are all very foundational and important ideas that we all aspire to in the programs that we work with. The real issue is implementation. The devil is going to be in the details. It's one thing to create a high level and exciting and visionary plan, but it's also important to think through how one might implement it. As director of IIM Calcutta, I've been thinking through various aspects of the implementation issues. Um, for example, reach in terms of uh, uh, taking education of the kind that we are talking about to distant corners of India and distant corners of the world. We really one of the issues that the education policy highlights is the capability to make education available, or the desire to make very high quality education available to everybody. That is really laudable, and that's something that we should all be thinking about how to accomplish going forward. So we're considering how one might bring that about. Again, the devil is in the details. Partnerships are going to be critical in making that happen. So one is reach and the reach. The other truly exciting aspect of the policy is the focus on research. Personally speaking, I think this is it's really just so important that when one is teaching, it's not really teaching, it's coaching. The best outcomes are achieved, I believe, by those who discover what they are teaching, and that takes us to research. India has so much capability to do world-class research. Funding is an important aspect, and so the to the extent that the national education policy creates a framework for providing that kind of funding, providing the incentives, and putting us on the map in a global map in terms of research is very exciting. Again, at IIM Calcutta, we're very keen to progress along that dimension as well. Let me stop here and let others speak for a minute. I have much more to say, but
Mr. Viswanathan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ritika. Unquestionably, the National Education Policy 2020 is a visionary document in every respect. I think it sets a very high bar for what the country can achieve over the next 20 plus years. And it is very progressive, as well as addresses the very critical issues of access and scalability. But we must accept that it is a policy, it's not a plan. The thought process for implementation is probably just beginning, as Dr. Seth referred to. If I had to, I would give it. In fact, one of our governing council members of Krea was involved in the writing of the policy, and he remarked to me that in many ways the policy Krea is a pilot implementation of the policy. So we certainly like it. We certainly think it's a visionary document. If I had to find fault, since you asked us to point out what might be better. So interdisciplinarity is, for the last 20, 30 years, ever since E.O. Wilson wrote that book on consilience and bringing sort of the boundaries between disciplines, sort of blurring the boundaries between disciplines, interdisciplinarity has been a thing. And the national education policy very clearly addresses that. But I wonder if perhaps we could have gone even beyond to perhaps taking a challenge-based approach to research as well as to learning, which really goes beyond interdisciplinarity into asking, what do we really need to know in order to solve the big problems of the world? So given that we're looking 20 years out, interdisciplinarity is very contemporary, it's very progressive, but if you had to say, how could we have done better? Perhaps we could have thought of a challenge-based approach. Let's stop here.
Mr. Gupta, please go ahead.
Well, I don't want to repeat, I think, whatever Anju and Kapil have already said, but I think the boldness of the policy is really for all of us to see, and especially in terms of two big metrics that it sets out. One is on gross enrollment ratio in higher education, going up from 26% to 50%, which would mean that we have to sort of double our higher education capacity in the next 15 years. So huge challenge of capacity addition. Clearly, I think it can't happen only by physical infrastructure. Digital will have to play a huge role. And the second, government talks of taking the budget of education to 6% of GDP, which I think is extremely welcome. So I think two very, very bold policy statements. The speakers before me have already said a lot will depend on how it's implemented. So I'm not sort of going to lament that fact. But I like the boldness of the policy. I think it's a huge statement, even though it's a statement of intent. It's a big statement. Now, particularly on higher education, I think 6 things sort of stand out for me when I look at it. I think one is this whole approach on education and pedagogy, whether it's multidisciplinary education, multi-level entry and exit, credit banking. I think these are all ideas that we've been waiting for. In some sense, they were overdue. A lot more could have been done, as Kapil said, but it's time that they were implemented, and one is hopeful that our regulatory bodies are going to be flexible. The second on research, and Anju's already spoken of it, we do need lots of research funding. The idea to set up a national research foundation is very welcome. On internationalization, the government actually speaks of foreign universities coming and setting up campuses. I'm not sure that's going to happen. It will take lots more. Setting up a university is a complex process with issues of land, issues of regulation. States are involved. A lot will depend. This is a national policy, and education is on the concurrent list. A lot is going to depend on how states take to this policy. Are they as flexible as the central government wants them to be? The fourth, really on this question of regulation, the conversation around setting up one commission, the Higher Education Commission of India, the fact that colleges should become autonomous all over the country. Now, that's extremely desirable, but do colleges have the capacity to become autonomous? Can they deal with that autonomy? I think those are questions we need to ask. Finally, the ideas on a common admissions test, again, welcome ideas. We need to see how that will be implemented. And finally, the sixth one on online education. In some sense, probably the government was reading that COVID is coming. So both the policy and the pandemic, I think, have accelerated digital transformation of education and how that plays out. So very bold, lots to be done. A lot will depend on how this gets implemented, but very welcome document.
Right. So actually, as all 3 panelists have actually pointed out, that the document is well-timed, well-intentioned. To me personally, I think it's ambitious in its tone. Sometimes I felt it's also a little overly optimistic, purely because it seems to put in a lot of faith in the government's ability to implement a lot of reforms. I'm only saying that only because we know that the bureaucracy and policymakers have at times struggled to implement reforms in a higher education space, also because education is a little resistant to change. I mean, change doesn't come in that easily. So for the discussion this evening, I think we should focus on about 4 to 5 broad areas, as in big reforms that we propose in the document, and the formidable execution challenge before the government. The first target that I would like to begin with, one that comes to mind, and is something that Mr. Gupta briefly mentioned in his opening remarks, was the target to actually double the gross enrollment ratio from 26 to 50% over the next 15 years. Mr. Viswanathan, I remember reading an op-ed by you in one of the newspapers, where you did this basic math to kind of illustrate what this really means in terms of starting new higher education institutions. So just for the benefit of the audience here, people watching and listening in, if you can actually take us through that basic math, I thought it would be interesting to kind of kickstart the discussion on this specific point, and then I'll ask more questions. What does this really mean in terms of starting new higher education institutions?
Sure. Will you be grading my answer? I'm just kidding. So to start with, the 25 going to 50% is actually misleading, because if you take 10 Indian students today, almost all 10 go to primary school, but only 5 come out of high school. The national education policy envisages that 10 out of 10 will come out of high school. And of the 5 that come out of high school today, maybe 1 or maybe 2 go on to college. So you're actually talking about a quadrupling of capacity, not a doubling of capacity. And we have about 1,000 universities today. And if you had to quadruple that, just assume that the enrollment size of each university is around the same as you expand, you need 4,000 new universities over the next 15, 20 years. And that's basically inaugurating a new university every other day. And for some of us like Vineet and myself, who've actually been part of setting up a new university, we kind of know that it takes a little longer than that. And so that there's a really a formidable implementation challenge in terms of scale. So I think, as Vineet alluded to early on, part of the solution has to come from some way of expanding capacity through the use of digital technology and delivery. For example, let's say at the moment, students spend about 8 months or 9 months a year on campus. Now, if we were able to supplement that with some form of asynchronous online learning, which they can do from wherever they are, and they only have to be on campus, say 6 months a year, you've got some capacity buffer there. So these are some ways we have to be imaginative. And this will also help address the issue of access. I mean, we're still, from an employment perspective, a very largely agrarian economy. And if we especially as we look into things like regional language education and so on, if you want to really expand access, you want to be able to think of creative ideas like maybe somebody involved in farming, somebody from a very small farming family has a few weeks between crop seasons, and that's the time they can actually be on campus, and the rest of the time they're learning online in their regional language. We have to think creatively to get to this sort of goal. And the other big thing, which I think you might come to in a separate point later on in the discussion, Ritika, is, so we all talk about access, but ultimately access to what? It's got to be access to something of value. And I think there are very valid questions one might ask as to what is the value in many of the tracks that are available today for a student graduating from high school. Unquestionably, there are some phenomenal institutions that have played a huge role in the country over the last 20, 30, 40 years. But as a system, we also have this question of what are we really delivering with higher education? And I guess that's, we'll come to the interdisciplinarity and other aspects of the discussion later on, I presume. So I'll stop here.
Mr. Gupta, as Mr. Viswanathan just mentioned, you and he have some experience in starting universities in this country. Just if you can, given that you have experience in this sector, drawing from your experience, how realistic do you think this target is? Mr. Viswanathan has spoken about it briefly, but given, in your experience, how realistic do this target is, and how can this be achieved without compromising on quality? This may address, as he pointed out, the issue of access, but what about quality? How does one achieve this target without compromising on that?
Yeah, I think the second point that you bring up is more relevant, Ritika. I do feel we are a very entrepreneurial nation and we respond to demand fairly quickly. Over 65% of our higher education today is in the private sector. And all of this, most of this capacity got created in the last 30 years. India has responded well to the capacity challenge in some sense. And the jury is out. Kapil's calculations seem pretty accurate. And, if we have to quadruple, the jury is out whether we'll be able to create that many universities. A part of me feels, yes, maybe we can, but definitely we can't create those many universities of quality, which is the point you bring up. And actually, if you see in the past, even in the last 30 years, if you look at the private higher education around us, most private higher education even today is suspect, right? We've done wonderfully well with our IITs, IIMs, a lot of other top quality institutions. We haven't done as well with private higher education. Well, there are examples. There are islands of excellence, and there are some great private universities, but the bulk of them are, can do better on excellence, whether teaching, whether research. So that, I think, really is the moot question. How will we create many more institutions of quality? I don't have an answer. We at Ashoka, when we started in 2008, we sort of created this new model of what we started calling collective philanthropy.
Right.
And many more institutions have come up. Kapil and I have known each other for a while. And it's been wonderful to see more institutions coming up in that manner. I don't think this model, though, is tenable in terms of capacity. Krea is there, Plaksha is coming up on a similar model. Some few more, maybe I hope 50 more come up in the next 10 years, right? But it's not going to go from 1,000 to 4,000. So clearly, I think there's a huge challenge. I mean, it's also an opportunity. Look, enrollment rates in the West are declining. In Europe are declining. Japan universities are shutting down. There are very few places in the world where new universities are opening. So we should also look at that as an opportunity. Huge opportunity to educate people, economic opportunity, employment opportunity. Universities are transformative. They transform the region in which they come up. That town, that city sort of transforms. So it's in some sense, it's also a huge opportunity, but lots of pieces of the puzzle need to fall in place if we create that capacity. And certainly digital will have to be a big piece. I think some of the models that Kapil spoke of, can students come on weekends? Can they, study from home? Can we flip the semester? Right now, students come in the semester, go home in vacation. There could be another set of students who study from home during the semester and come to campus during vacation, right? So we use the campus in that time. So I think all of these models will have to come into play as we expand capacity. But I am an internal optimistic. I do feel this is an opportunity for India. I do hope more universities get created and more universities of quality.
I would like to bring Dr. Seth into this discussion, but we on a different topic. Given that we are pressed for time, I do want to cover as many bases as I can. Dr. Seth, as far as the NEP is concerned, there's another promise that it makes in terms of sweeping autonomy that it promises to all higher education institutions. Unlike a lot of proposals in this document, fortunately for this proposal, we do have a reference point. The Indian Institutes of Management have been given that autonomy, at least the autonomy model that's been proposed in that document. It is pretty similar, pretty much the same as what has been given to the IIMs. Just to kind of quickly take the audience through, I mean, for the uninitiated, it basically, the document says that all of the higher education institutions will have to be incentivized, mentored, and by 2035, the policy hopes that all of these institutions will become autonomous and will have empowered board of governors, boards which will function with least interference from the government. These boards would be empowered to take administrative, academic decisions freely, which is something actually that the IIMs, as I mentioned earlier, have already been given. So I'm presuming a lot of higher education institutions will actually be looking at the IIM experience to gauge the government's sincerity on meeting this promise. So Dr. Seth, if you can tell us what the experience has been and whether the bureaucracy finally trusts the IIMs with that level of autonomy. Dr. Seth, if you could please unmute yourself.
So my academic experience has primarily been in the West. I have come to India every year pretty much to teach at ASB, and for many years. And I would like to spend just a minute talking about a fundamental difference in the way universities in the West and universities in India or institutes like IIM in India operate. There's so much in the West, the idea of autonomy is just taken for granted. Autonomy in the sense that there is the brand identity of the institution is the driver of quality. In other words, if I'm, a university, if I'm Harvard, I'm not worrying about a regulator. There's no regulator that's sitting watching over my shoulder. I'm very intent on protecting the value of the education that I have built up that brand over a century, right? So I don't need a regulator looking over my shoulder. The IIMs, IIM Calcutta is one of the, we are the oldest of the IIMs. We similarly have an identity that is very well established. I'm actually a graduate of IIM Calcutta from way back when. And so I think when we think about autonomy, what does that really mean? I translate that to meaning that the regulator now thinks that the institute is mature enough to worry about, to self-police. It does not need a watchdog looking over its shoulder to make sure that it is delivering that quality that it has promised to engage in. So this I totally subscribe to. I think that there should be autonomy. I think that there is a twin side of it. Autonomy has to be accompanied by transparency. If the absence of transparency is just meaningless, it will create an autonomy that is fraught with problems in terms of the fly-by-night kinds of operators, which we don't want to see associated with the growth plans that we have here. So that was a sort of philosophical statement about autonomy. I personally find that the regulator has always been our good friend. This is the way I think that I've dealt with regulators, whether it's in the US or here. Their job is to support our institutes and universities to help them get better. That's the experience I've had with them. And I hope that that's the case. It will be the case going forward.
Mr. Gupta, you had briefly mentioned autonomy in your opening remarks. And if I'm not wrong, you said something to the effect that you're not sure if every higher education institution in the country probably is responsible enough to handle that autonomy. If you could just elaborate on that point, please.
Right. I think the challenge, at least the challenge I find with regulation and autonomy with a lot of our regulatory bodies is that it's sort of this one size fits all regulation, right? So what you have is that for a university, which is supposedly, delivering high quality education and doing things in the manner they should be done, the same sort of regulation applies to that versus someone, who may not be doing things in the right manner. And somehow the regulation is designed for the common minimum sort of denominator, and that doesn't push the boundary of excellence, right? So, and if you recall, the last 2 decades, equally, there have been multiple instances of scams happening where you had some shops open up who were distributing degrees, and, the universities didn't exist. There were multiple such instances that have happened in the last 25 years. They've stopped now in the last 7-8 years. So, there are these two extremes. There are extremes where universities are doing an outstanding job and sometimes are over-regulated, over-governed. And then there are institutions which don't even exist and they get away, right? So the same regulatory system is sort of presiding over both types of institutions. So when I mentioned, and that's the challenge we are dealing with, right? We have outstanding universities all over the country, but equally there are universities or colleges around the country who may not be as responsible, right? Now, what does autonomy mean for those institutions, right? Can they afford autonomy? Can, equally, and what does autonomy mean for institutions like an IIM Calcutta, which doesn't, need to need to define or prove what it's doing. It has to be something different. So I think that's the challenge we have to navigate. Very clear guidelines, different criteria for different universities, and simplify regulation, maybe create some more, but simplify it, right? So I think those were, if I've been able to explain, I think that's the sort of challenge I see in regulation.
So in effect, the kind of graded autonomy that has been talked about in the NEP, where you promise autonomy to institutions which meet a certain mark, right? A certain benchmark. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. And I think the NEP really makes the intent is absolutely right again.
Okay.
They talk about, so, there is conversation that St. Stephen's College, and I'm taking that name because everybody knows it's synonymous with high quality. St. Stephen's College should become anonymous and may become autonomous. Now, that's a great thing to happen, right? But equally, if there is a college somewhere else in the country, which is not as responsible, one has to be careful. Now, the problem in India that happens is that when you start these rules, you don't know what gets away and what doesn't. I think the implementation of our policies and regulation has been rather poor. So that's something that we have to worry about. So again, what I think the point I'm making is great intent and a great statement in policy. However, we have to see how it gets implemented.
Can I make a quick point here? Point here that when we consider regulation, one substitute could be accreditation. When you have bodies that provide quality assessment and can certify quality in a fashion that is transparent and that is understandable by the world, this is a perfectly reasonable way to think about, in a practical sense, an alternative to regulation that accompanies autonomy and supports autonomy.
Right. Mr. Viswanathan, I just wanted to quickly ask you again, given that you're part of a new university, an up and coming university, what has your experience been with the higher education regulators? And is there a freedom, do you think? I mean, the policy says that this would happen over a period of 15 years. Is there a freedom that you think should be prioritized over others as far as higher education institutions are concerned? Or is there some kind of interference that you have encountered which you think should be done away with as soon as possible?
I'll begin by saying, Ritika, that I just want to underline that autonomy is not the same as no governance. Autonomy means self-governance. So this is not the Wild West. I mean, autonomy is not sort of leading to the Wild West. And to that extent, I think, wearing an institutional hat, of course, we'd love as much autonomy as we can so that we may self-regulate and self-govern in pursuit of our mission. Wearing a systemic hat and looking especially at the Indian context, I think there is a need to control for adverse incentives. So there has been a history of profiteering in what is de jure been a not-for-profit space. And with a profit motive comes cutting of corners and compromising learning outcomes and quality of education, etc. So I think the way the policy lays it out is actually very, very meaningful, because they do talk about light but tight. So it's not that they are looking to see how they can control for those adverse incentives. And yes, as an institution, we've been pretty fortunate so far to be well supported in all the areas that we need support from the government. And we hope that that will continue both at the central and state government. I mean, as a private state university, there's not that much dependence on the central and state governments, but all from wearing an institutional hat, we're all for autonomy.
Right. Is there like I asked, any sort of any freedom that you think should be prioritized over others, given that the policy sees this as a 15-20 year journey towards sort of making as many institutions autonomous?
No, I think they've got this one right. I think it's not a question of prioritizing freedom A over B. It's more a question of prioritizing which, how are you going to sort of vet for which institutions pass the incentive test. And I think so. In that sense, I think they've got they've sort of they're thinking on the right lines on this one, I think.
So, since we are on the issue of autonomy, I would like to kind of get your views on the topic of regulation as well. The policy proposes to replace the UGC, which is the University Grants Commission, and the AICT with this umbrella body, which it proposed to call the Higher Education Commission of India. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this proposal, given that some would say that maybe we're just replacing one structure with another, given that it's the same set of bureaucrats who will be manning the new body as well. So just to get, if each of you all can kind of give us your thoughts on this, whether do you think this would be successful?
Well,
sorry, yeah, what to say? Go ahead.
A great deal depends upon what is the role of the body that we're talking about. UGC has some very specific objectives that it is required to fulfill, as does AICTE. These are inconsistent with the light but tight model of governance that we've been talking about that imply autonomy. So the devil is going to be in the details of specifying exactly what is the role of the new regulator. It's perfectly feasible to get once if it's done right. But I think that those details I need to understand better. And I don't understand them as yet.
Right. Mr. Gupta?
So I would agree, intentionally, it's a good step. One regulator getting AICT and UGC together, but many unanswered questions. For example, the medical council and the council that governs law colleges, that continues, that will exist, right? So they don't merge with the Higher Education Commission.
Right.
Higher education is on the concurrent list. So Ashoka, for example, we are governed by the Haryana State Private University Act. Right? We have to follow UGC norms, but we equally have to follow the Haryana norms. Now, I don't think that's going away. So I think there is a fair bit of devil in the detail. I think the document does say light but tight and wants to go in the right direction, but a lot is going to depend on the detail. This is fairly complex in my mind.
Right. Mr. Viswanathan?
Not really much to add except one point, which is that apart from the restructuring of the governance institutions, there is also a restructuring of the individual institutions themselves. I think there's there are probably 10 or 15 different categories of private and public universities and colleges and higher education institutions. There's also a drastic simplification and consolidation of that's been conceived that goes hand in hand with the restructuring of the regulatory bodies, so to speak. So again, in terms of intent and plan, I mean, as a policy document, sounds really good, but we'll have to see the fine print, and the devil is very much in the detail on this one.
Right. I think we should now move on to the proposal with regard to interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity in the policy document. Again, for the benefit of the audiences listening in, basically the policy proposes that by 2040, all higher education institutions should aim to become multidisciplinary. Coming to Mr. Viswanathan and Mr. Gupta, given your experience of starting multidisciplinary liberal arts university, Krea University, as well as Ashoka, and now Mr. Gupta, you're trying to start another multidisciplinary university in the area of STEM, Plaksha University. Drawing from your experience, could you give us a sense of what have the challenges been in terms of starting a multidisciplinary institution in a country like ours, where interdisciplinarity as a concept is pretty much alien to most people? What have the challenges been? The reason why I ask you this question is because the government is trying to implement this on a much larger scale. So the challenges that you've faced, your experience would kind of give us a sense of the execution challenge before the government, as far as bringing in interdisciplinarity across higher education institutions are concerned. So can we start with you, Mr. Viswanathan?
Sure, Ritika. I think you partially answered your own question. So there is a fairly substantial mindset shift that is required. Academia, not just in India, but across the world, has largely been siloed and disciplinary for a very, very large number of years. To really find a set of scholars who think beyond their discipline and lean into other disciplines voluntarily is not the most common, especially in a country like India. So there is a substantial mindset shift involved that we as an institution have had to grapple. And in our case, we're also not thinking of our model of learning as simply interdisciplinary. We've added a whole lot of other bells and whistles to it. We call it interwoven learning. We don't call it liberal arts and sciences, although we often get categorized as such. The liberal arts and sciences have had to answer, in the traditional sense, have had to answer some existential questions even in the West. So we've taken some of the good aspects of that, and what we call interwoven learning makes the challenge even more complicated at an institutional level. So to do this at a systemic level is going to be, really a challenge at a different order of magnitude. But the advantage that we have is that we are creating a whole bunch of new capacity now, or we have to rather. And that may be, it's much easier to start a new institution with this sort of a mindset than to turn around an existing institution and bring it to and in fact, I'd love to hear personally, I'd love to hear Dr. Seth's views on this as a leader of an existing entrance institution, and how you think about managing change and bringing about different mindsets among the faculty. Let's hear that, Dr. Seth.
Yes, yeah. Well, carry on with that. I'm happy to contribute to this question. So I think let me just make one remark about which is a critique of the act requiring all institutions to be universities. This is a one-size-fits-all strategy that should not be imposed, I believe, on every academic institution. Now, what I think is important is to think about what is the strategy and what are its objectives. Why is interdisciplinarity important? It is important to be able to allow our learners to solve the big problems of the day and of the future. It is important to help them to become lifelong learners. It's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, right? And if we think in that fashion and we consider what are the different kinds of mechanisms that we might use in order to bring about that kind of mindset change that considers that we are here to solve those big problems of the future, and we are going to be able to learn every possible tool that enables us to get there. And then our job as an institute or as a university is to equip our students to acquire these tools and these skills and the capabilities and the techniques. So that's how I think about this interdisciplinarity and multidiscipline kinds of ideas. I was very fortunate in the US. I was at universities which were large universities with great engineering schools and great business schools, and was very happy to work closely as a business person. My field is strategy and international business. Work very happily with the engineers and with the scientists and with the ag schools in order to solve the problems. We can do that with partnerships. You do not have to be in the same university to be able to create that kind of collaboration. What you need is a mindset. And Kapil, going back to the idea of mindset, this is a different style of thinking, that we are open for doing things in new ways. That's culture change of very major fashion. Go ahead.
Well, I can just add my 2 bits. So, Ritika, I think the first challenge was clearly regulatory. And I can recall a small story, So we started this undergraduate degree in politics, philosophy, and economics, which was, as the name suggests, extremely interdisciplinary. When it came up for regulatory approval, this was on the desk for a few months, because we were trying to answer, will it account for politics, or will it account for philosophy, or will it account for economics, and are we going to be giving enough credits in each, which clearly, well, fortunately we navigated. So there are regulatory challenges where regulators have a bit of a tough time understanding what some of these degrees may be, right? Some are easier. Equally, we had challenges with some of our master's program. We run this 1-year program, which is fairly interdisciplinary in the liberal arts. Just trying to explain to people, some felt it's like an MBA like, some felt it is professional. So, I think that vocabulary doesn't exist. But hopefully, I'm sure it'll get sorted. I think the second has been really finding faculty. For a long time, at least, I do think some of our oldest universities were fairly interdisciplinary. But over time, at least in the last 40, 50 years, our institutions have been more siloed. I went to one of them. IITs were largely about engineering, and we hardly got too much exposure to other disciplines, which now when you come out and you start living a life and you realize that, you probably needed to learn all of those things. So I think our education, in the new institutions that came up in the last 40, 50 years have been largely siloed, not only in terms of disciplines, but also some are teaching, some are research. The fortunate part is India has outstanding talent, so you do find some good people everywhere. So I think those two, the third fortunate piece, I would say, is students actually get it very quickly. So, if you tell students that, look, this is what you're doing, they actually love it. They get the message very quickly. They adapt very quickly. Once they come in, they find they can explore multiple interests. So the receptivity from the student side is very high. And that, so that sort of helps, motivates faculty, and it becomes a positive cycle.
Right.
Can I say something there? So, Vineet, as you said, there's a great deal of talent, and I think you're absolutely right. But I also think there's not enough. This is a huge opportunity to strengthen our PhD programs. I believe it is such a crying need to be able to find and the kind of skill set. This is the academic career is a labor of love, as we all know, right? We don't get into the business because we want to be billionaires. And to find that kind of mindset and then be able to provide the training to be able to develop it into the research and teaching capabilities that we want to see staffing the institutions. This, I don't believe we have enough of. We need much more of it. So what an opportunity for collaboration across different institutions to build those strong PhD programs.
Sure.
Right. So I think we should now move on to the recommendation. This is something that probably has stirred some controversy in the school education space. That is, the policy focuses on encouraging the mother tongue as a medium of instruction, or the regional language as a medium of instruction. For me personally, what's interesting is that even as people debate whether or not using the mother tongue as a medium of instruction is good for children in school, my sense is that this change would probably come in much faster and probably come in first in the higher education space, because the government is moving pretty quickly on that. They have set up a task force on this. They've even asked the Indian Institutes of Technology to offer the BTech program, or rather offer bilingual programs. And that has recently evoked an interesting reaction from one of the IIT directors. If I'm not wrong, the IIT Delhi director recently in a social media post said that this wasn't feasible. He obviously said this in his personal capacity, that this could be the beginning of the end of the IITs, also because you're not producing technologists for a state, you are producing global technologists. I just wanted to kind of bring each one of you in to get a sense of how practical do you think this suggestion is, and whether this is implementable. Can we start with you, Dr. Seth?
No, forgive me. I don't see how it's going to be implementable in the IIM system. I just don't understand how that will work. In the short, we've got other things that really are very important to us to focus in the short and medium run. I think it's a great idea to have business education in regional languages, but probably not at the master's level. I would suggest that that would be more valuable at the undergraduate, a BBA kind of degree sort of thing. Um, and we don't do BBAs.
Ma'am, why do you think this would not be valuable at the master's level?
Again, it's the same idea. I think that the IIT Delhi director addressed are us when we are when we think strategically about the education that we promise our students, it is for a global market. Our alums are not alums that are in any region; they're around the world, and and we expect them to be leaders around the world, not just in India. So I don't, it's a valuable option, but it's not clear to me that this is it's something that can or should be imposed in every institution. We all have different strategies. We should be allowed to proceed with those strategies and develop them. But I also do think there's a great opportunity for somebody out there to develop, have that regional language institution.
Mr. Gupta, is that do you see that as a great opportunity?
Well, I think it's an opportunity, but I think it's a bigger challenge, if I may say. And I think for the following reasons. Higher educational institutions fundamentally start with faculty, right? Getting trained faculty of that caliber, we're struggling to get them in the language that we've been teaching for the last 50 years. And now to develop that caliber of faculty. So that's one. I think faculty is one big challenge. Now, what about post-college opportunities for students, right? I mean, eventually they will graduate and they will go into the world, right? Whether they do research or they go into the world of business or they become entrepreneurs, they have to navigate the world, right? So I think it's a fundamental sort of alignment of what they did in school, what they will do in college, and what they will do post-college. My sense would be that developing languages which students can take up as courses would be outstanding, but whether the medium of instruction becomes in regional languages, that I do feel would be a tough challenge, to be honest.
Mr. Viswanathan?
Yes, I have a slightly contrarian view here. As you start to expand access, I think it's inevitable that we would have to do this at some point sooner than later. I mean, much has been written about this, but the India that we all live in is really not the India that 80% of the country which works in the informal economy. I mean, just think about that data point, right? 80% of India's population, give or take, depending on which survey you look at, works in the informal economy. And why is English of relevance in the informal economy? So I think as a nation, if we have to expand access, I think it's inevitable. Wearing an institutional hat, it's extremely difficult. There I concur with my fellow panelists. It's very difficult to do. We already have members of our faculty at Krea who've done in Hindi, YouTube lessons in Hindi and just put it out there for free. And there's been good uptake, etc. So I think we have a duty to expand access and really build an ecosystem of higher education. I mean, we've got to think beyond the India that we live in and of the India that is really the majority, in the heartland. So that's my contrarian view, I guess.
Ritika, I wanted to make a point here, which is related. Often, and this is also something which has come up in the education policy, we've built universities in a sort of a singular manner, all intended to be education and research. And if you see the classical Carnegie classification, having these vocational colleges, education, and universities for teaching and research. I think to Kapil's point, I definitely feel on the vocational side and institutions which are teaching only, there is a case for studies in the regional languages. But institutions which are sort of research universities, it's going to be tougher. So I just wanted to.
How do you, I mean, you have pointed out that recruiting faculty for bilingual or programs in regional languages would be a challenge. Can you propose a solution for that, or you don't see an immediate solution to that?
Maybe Kapil, let's start with Kapil on this one.
Kapil, of course, you had a contrarian view on this, but yeah.
I mean, I think if you can't do it in a country like India, whereas, I mean, most of us are bilingual at least, right? So I think it may not have been done before, but I think I really feel a sense of duty as we expand access, that as institutions and as individuals, that we should make an effort to get comfortable in the non-English language that all of us inevitably speak, and try to at least some courses and some form of learning. It's within our, I think it's within our reach if we, over a period of time, and if we tried hard enough. And I think we don't have a choice as a nation. If we want to expand access as we should, as envisaged in the policy, I don't know that we have a choice in this.
Viswanathan, just quickly, if I could get a reaction to something else that the IIT director had mentioned in his social media post, and I'm quoting him. He said, start quote, IIT education involves integration of a lot of research and open study materials. Offering complete BTech and master's courses in local languages will deprive students of a vast amount of resource material available in English. As said, by translating a few books to English, the problem cannot be solved. Can I get your quick reaction to that?
This question is for...
Actually, feel free to go ahead and answer that question. I'm just looking for a quick reaction from the panelists to that.
Well, I think that's a valid comment. I mean, I'm sure Anju can answer that much better than either Kapil or I can. But I mean, I agree with him. I think it's a huge challenge. You know, a lot of this body of research material, journals, publications, books may not be existing in regional languages. And that's the reason Ritika pointed out that maybe for vocational and teaching, there is a case for regional languages.
Okay.
I think for universities, which are, masters, research, definitely, I think it's going to be a big challenge.
Dr. Seth?
Yeah. Really for business schools is a real problem. The issue of trying to get materials, research materials, textbooks, journals, is just not feasible. But also when you think about the research endeavor in the kind of institution that we aspire to be, we also want to be firmly positioned for global eminence. This is a strategic decision. It's not easy for us, one, to think about being firmly embedded in the global marketplace of ideas and simultaneously be thinking about real impact in the region, in a regional language. As I said, it can be done, I'm sure, but it's just not our strategy for the time being.
Right. We're pressed for time. I think we'll have to move on to audience questions soon, but I would quickly like to squeeze in another reform proposed in the new education policy before I can move on to the audience questions. This is on internationalization. And Mr. Gupta, I mean, given that you head Jamboree Education, which coaches thousands of students in India every year who are keen on pursuing higher education abroad, I was just wondering if I could get your views on whether you think inviting foreign universities to set up campuses here in India, whether that could actually contribute towards internationalizing Indian higher education, and if that in any way could stop or would encourage students to actually stay back to pursue, at least the ones who are keen to go abroad, if it would encourage them to stay back and pursue higher education. I'm asking this question given that you have a fair bit of experience in this sector and you have your Jamboree Education deals with students and parents who are keen to send their kids abroad for higher education.
So Ritika, two responses. I think first is whether universities are actually eager to come and open campuses here, right? Even if the government of India is inviting them. My sense is out of 10 universities you speak to abroad, maybe one is interested, 9 are not even interested, right? The top ones for sure are not interested. You ask a Harvard, Stanford, they're not keen.
Okay.
It's not in their mission, right? And look at globally. I mean, Yale went to Singapore. Uh, you know, but the Singapore government pretty much footed the whole bill. They gave them land, they gave them buildings. Look at Saudi Arabia, KAUST went. But these universities were set up with a huge amount of investment by the governments of those countries, whether it's Qatar, Singapore. There are a few examples. China. Now, I don't think government of India plans to do that. So, firstly, very few universities are interested, and to translate foreign universities coming up and opening campuses is going to be tough. The government has tried this for the last 25 years. There are issues of land acquisition, there are issues of FCRA, repatriation. So it's going to be tough, right? It's a lot of reform required. Second, I think whether even if some of them come, will students stop going abroad? I don't think so. Students will still go abroad, because students go abroad not only for the education, but also for the international experience, the opportunity to be able to live and work in that country, the opportunity to be with people of different cultures. There are aspirations. People want to go to top universities. Ask a student, they want to go to a Stanford, they want to go to a Berkeley, they want to go to an Oxford. So I don't think foreign universities coming to India is welcome. I do think so. It will stretch and push all of us. Whether it'll happen, I would be happy, but I have serious concerns, and I think it's going to be very tough. A lot of reform required. Whether it'll stop Indian students from going abroad, I don't think so.
Mr. Viswanathan, your reaction to what Mr. Gupta just said, do you agree? Do you disagree with him?
Yeah, I think I agree with most of what Vineet said. I'd also add that the internationalization is being conceived only for the top 100 global universities. And as Vineet rightly said, the top 100 are, universities are not expansionary by nature. And the few experiments, such as the ones that Vineet alluded to, have caused a reasonable amount of disruption that I think any good university with an expansionary mindset will certainly think twice about establishing a campus abroad. So I think that's as Vineet said, if it were to happen, we would certainly welcome it, because it's we need to build an ecosystem. Individual institutions are great, but to really serve the needs of the nation, we need to build a higher ed ecosystem. We would certainly welcome it, but I don't see a great interest among. It's just not in their. They're just not expansionary like companies are or for-profit ventures are. I've heard. We often say that universities are the polar extreme of companies, and I think Vineet will also attest to the fact that we've both seen it to be substantially true in many instances over the past several years.
Right. I think it's almost 7:30. I think we should take a few questions from the audience. Manjari Kamath, she has a question. What do the panelists think will be the impact of doing away with the MPhil degree program in higher education institutions? Any one of y'all can take this question.
I think we should lean on Anju to answer this one.
Dr. Seth?
Considering that we typically offer MBA and PGDBA, postgraduate diplomas in business. So I'm sorry, I really would not be the expert on MPhil.
All right. Okay. Moving on to the next question. This is an anonymous attendee. I have a very simple question to all the panelists. What is the role of academic freedom in rejuvenating higher education? Can you imagine academic freedom without autonomy? What about regular interferences from the government, especially in appointing incompetent VCs to shutting out critical voices in the campuses? Mr. Gupta, would you like to?
Well, I think, whoever has asked the question has actually touched a pain point in Indian higher education. When we talk about our public higher education has built some outstanding institutions. We are all products of that system. So that's the good part. But what the pain points, and maybe those pain points are not uniform, are some of the ones that have been spoken of. Appointments are delayed. Are the best people getting appointed? I think so sometimes, but equally sometimes not. I was told recently that maybe 3 or 4 IITs don't have directors currently. So I think this is right. I think it is these pain points are there which need to be solved.
Let's take this question from Rukmini Nair. She's a professor at IIT Delhi. She has 2 questions. I'm reading out one of them. Regarding access and quality, our universities and schools most significantly lack the lifeblood that animates all education, namely teachers by the lakhs. How is this foundational lacuna in our educational systems addressed in the NEP? And can students of established networks such as the IITs and as well as the new universities like Ashoka help fill this lacuna by being incentivized/inspired to teach a question-based and naturally interdisciplinary kind of PCM, etc., to school children well before they actually get to universities? Would Kapil, Dr. Seth, would anyone want to take this question?
So is the question about how higher educational institutions would assist primary school children?
Not exactly private school children, but school children per se. I mean, whether these universities basically can help fill this lacuna basically to can help school children. I mean, it's not about private school children.
I can tell you some very exciting experiments that I've seen that have worked remarkably well, and that these are associated with entrepreneurial activities. Now, entrepreneurship is an area of great excitement in India, and one really important aspect of entrepreneurship is taking education to all levels, whether school children or to different parts of the country, and thus and so on. So, how we as a business school help in this kind of endeavor is that we have an incubator, and we encourage entrepreneurs in the incubator who work jointly with students and our alumni mentors to be able to create the kinds of programs that deliver the goods, as it were. So, it's a question, it's the connections that we can build. If we can network and build these exciting connections and think about and see how we can reach that ultimate objective. I mean, I really like the ultimate objective that was espoused in this question. So I think, again, it's about creativity. How can we get there? Certainly, there's a way that IIMs and business schools can help.
The next question is from Aparna Deshpande. This question is actually for you, Dr. Seth. My question is related to the point made by Anju Seth regarding strengthening our PhD program. Do you envisage having interdisciplinary PhD programs? If yes, which subjects would be good to start with for such a novel enterprise?
Well, I have been a PhD program coordinator in many of the years that I've taught. I've taught PhD seminars around the world, and they have all been interdisciplinary PhD seminars. So I really think that is just so important. Why is interdisciplinarity so important? It is the world of ideas. When you're trying to understand phenomena, ultimately, what is research? It is really getting to the heart of a cause and effect associated with a particular phenomenon. And the more creativity that you can bring to that endeavor, the better. And creativity is so fueled by the interaction of ideas across different disciplines. This is tremendously exciting. Um, I think that I constantly chat with other IIM directors. I chat with folks around the world. We have an organization called GSBN that's been trying to bring this into the fold here. So we have educationists in different parts of the world. We have PhD students sitting here. Our faculty teaching to students around the world. So that collaboration is amazing. But it's not an easy one to get off the ground. It's again requires a change in the expectation. What exactly is a PhD seminar? How does one approach teaching a PhD seminar? These are all issues that are addressed. It's a different way of doing things, but it's very exciting.
I'll take just one more question. Why not increase capacities in IITs and IIMs if they are established institutions globally? I think this is again meant for you, Dr. Seth. The NEP actually does talk about, when it talks about increasing the gross enrollment ratio, of doubling that, it says that a lot of that responsibility lies with the existing institutions, that a lot of that capacity enhancement should come from the established institutions. When we look at the IIMs in comparison to the IITs, they are much smaller in terms of student strength. Their expansion has not been as exponential as it has been for the IITs. A question, do you think the IIMs are up for that task? Would the IIMs expand in terms of student strength to actually achieve or to contribute towards the GER target?
Absolutely. So I think there are two ways in which the IIMs are expanding. One, there have been newer IIMs. There are more IIMs than there were. And the second, the old IIMs are getting bigger. So we are expanding. We have an ambitious growth plan within IIM Calcutta. In our Joka campus, I'm very happy that we've been given really prime land for a satellite campus close to the airport in Calcutta. So there are very exciting possibilities going forward. I want to also emphasize another critical aspect of growth, and that is welcoming international students to our campus. It's just so important to have a diverse classroom, and we're very fortunate to have students from around India. We are happy to have great gender diversity, but having students from different parts of the world also collaborating in the classroom is a great opportunity for us. And I think one aspect of the NEP that we would also like to applaud is the ambition of becoming a global hub for education. We can absolutely deliver on that, and we should be really focused on making that happen.
I'm afraid that's all the time that we have. I would like to thank all the panelists for an engaging discussion, and also like to thank Asia Society for organizing this discussion. I'd hand over to you, Karishma, for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. We really value all your opinions, and thank you for taking out the time to speak to us. The discussion was fantastic. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and have a great weekend. Look forward to our next program, which is coming next week. It will be on in the arts and culture space. So please stay tuned and look forward to all our program invitations. Thank you, and have a good evening.